Hello, thank you so much for tuning in to ACTV. I'm Jenny Davidson, your host today, and I am the CEO and Executive Director at Stand Up Placer. Stand Up Placer has been in our community serving survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking for over 40 years now. We host the county's only confidential safe house in an undisclosed location where we have 55 beds, 13 bedrooms, 5 kitchens. It's a beautiful place for victims of crime to be able to go and be safe. We also have 40 units of housing out in the community where folks go and live for 12 to 24 months and are able to recover from the trauma that's happened. We have a therapy team, support groups, a full-time family law attorney, and a lot of more services for our survivors in our community. And today I'm lucky enough to be joined by Miss Renee Williams, who is one of our therapists on staff. So thank you so much.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. And today we are going to be talking about childhood trauma. And thank you so much for tuning in today. We're going to have a follow-up episode. I don't know if it'll be directly after this or another time during the month. So stay tuned to ACTV and you'll get to catch both halves of that important conversation. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you again.
And so this whole issue of childhood trauma, tell me a little bit more. What is trauma when we use that word?
Yeah, that's a great question. Trauma is kind of one of those broad terms that gets used for a wide variety of things that happen to us. And trauma, emotional and psychological trauma, is a lot like physical trauma. It's a broad term for something that affects us psychologically and emotionally.
Awesome. And are there different kinds of trauma?
Yeah, there are. That's another great question. So when we're assessing for trauma, we're looking at 3 main types. The first is what we call acute trauma. So that's a trauma that happens when there's a single incident. So maybe a car accident or something like that. The next is chronic. So chronic trauma is a trauma that happens over a long period of time, but it's a single trauma. The next is complex trauma, and that's traumas that happen over a wide range of time, and there's multiple traumas happening at the same time. There's also a few other traumas that we're kind of looking at in the field recently, and that's developmental trauma. So that's trauma that happens to people before the age of 18. And there's also secondary trauma. So that's what happens to first responders a lot of the time. So those of us that are police officers or maybe therapists or people that just hold other people's traumas.
That's great. That's a great explanation. And when would a person know that they might need to seek help? They've had a traumatic thing happen and now they're thinking, I wonder if I need some help from someone for this.
Yeah. Traumas happen to many of us, and so when a person might want to seek help for that trauma is when it really starts to impact their life. So maybe they feel like they can't do the things that they would normally do on a weekly or daily basis. Maybe they're struggling with leaving the house. Maybe they're not hanging out with friends like they once used to. So the first answer is when it affects your life. And the second answer is from when it's happening for about a month or more.
Okay. And how would you define resiliency?
Resiliency, to sum it up, is something that is the ability to bounce back from a traumatic event.
Okay. And if I got diagnosed with acute stress disorder or PTSD, what does that mean for, does that mean that I'm not resilient or does it mean that that there's something else I should know or what would happen, or even maybe tell us what is PTSD?
Yeah. So to answer that question, post-traumatic stress is a response to trauma that is happening for far too long. So often the symptoms of what we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, are things that don't serve us anymore that served us well when the trauma was happening. So for example, hypervigilance or really being aware of your surroundings is something that happens with PTSD. So during the traumatic incident, that was something that really could potentially make you be able to live through the trauma. So maybe there's a car accident and you're really on alert as a driver from there on out. What happens is when that gets in the way of us functioning, maybe you're not going out and driving anymore. That can really kind of be where PTSD interferes with how we're functioning.
And do you see resilience? Like, would that mean if somebody is diagnosed with PTSD that they lack resilience, or how do those two interact?
Absolutely not. If somebody doesn't have what we call resiliency after a traumatic event, it doesn't mean that you're not resilient. It doesn't mean that there's something wrong with you. I like to think of resiliency as kind of a fuel tank, and resiliency is made up of having good coping skills, knowing that I'm a good person, knowing that I'll be okay. And when we have low fuel in that area and something traumatic happens, sometimes it can be hard to have that resiliency. And so we can do lots of things to build up that resiliency, whether it's through therapy, self-caring on your own, taking care of your needs. That tank can get replenished pretty easily.
I really liked how you compared some of the things that could happen to us with the like PTSD and stuff with other kind of like physical trauma. If you you're in a car accident and you break your leg and you need a cast, you might need some rehabilitation, some physical therapy, and that's expected. And if you skip physical therapy appointments, your friends and family are going to say, hey, you need to get in there and get your physical therapy and do it on time and take care of yourself. But sometimes there's either a stigma or, people might have a harder time accessing therapy for the pretty equal side of the psychological effects of experiencing trauma, correct? And what are some ways that the movement or I know that has changed a lot over the last few years, but how do you see that kind of playing out?
Yeah, that's such a good point. When something physical happens to us, maybe we scrape our knee or we have a broken bone, no one looks at us and says, hey, get over it. You shouldn't be affected by that big scrape on your knee or that broken bone. Emotional and psychological treatment are really the same. It's really going in, cleaning out that wound, stabilizing that bone, being able to get treatment for it. So there is a movement in the field really to take off the D in PTSD and just call it post-traumatic stress, because it really is just that. Our bodies are naturally wired to have a stress response when we experience something traumatic, and it's just not serving us anymore. So we need to tell ourselves, our bodies, our minds, that we don't need to be hypervigilant anymore. We can move into just vigilance.
Awesome. And a big study came out years ago that Kaiser and the CDC did together called the ASA Study, Adverse Childhood Experiences. Can you tell us a little bit about what they are or what kind of impact that might have?
Yeah, so they came out with a study that basically correlated early childhood traumas to things like health consequences that happen later in life. And what that study looked at was things like abuse, neglect, divorce, incarceration, mental health, and substance uses. And really what that study has kind of helped us understand is that A, trauma is real. B, it's not just something to get over, to walk off, or to pull yourself up by your bootstraps and get over. And C, that there is recovery and that you are not doomed if you do experience trauma.
Awesome. And if people at home want to get more information about ACEs, and I think there are 9 questions, is that something that's available online? They could look at that and...
Absolutely. It's very readily available, and there's also a lot of great resources like TED Talks. There's several TED Talks out there that really kind of go in depth of what ACEs are, how they can affect us, and what the recovery is like.
And so people take this test online, right? Or with their doctor or their therapist, and they look at these 9 questions. And I know they've expanded a little bit, somewhat, just to kind of look at are there things outside of these 9 questions that may also have a hugely traumatic effect? And obviously there are, because you can't think of all of them. But so they look at this, they take their score, or they figure out where they're at, right? Does that mean, like, say out of these 9 questions, I answer yes to 6 of them? What does that mean for me as an adult, or when I look at things that my child has experienced? What does it mean for my child?
What it means is that you've experienced some things. Some of those things are highly out of our control, and there's nothing that, we could do to prevent those things. And so I think that if you are saying to yourself right now, wow, I have a high number of ACEs, the first thing is I want to tell you, the fact that you know that you have a lot of ACEs is the first step. It's really not something that is going to determine your lifespan or your ability to recover. The fact that you know about it can be the thing that really propels you to get treatment, to talk about it, to find out that there are other people out there with a high number of ACEs. And yeah.
And then what are some of those adult, so ACEs are all about, if you have this adverse childhood experience, right? Say a 4-year-old has a parent who is abusing substances, there's domestic violence going on in their home, one parent goes to prison, and then they've also then experienced divorce, right? So that they've had 4 adverse childhood experiences, and it was a very traumatic time. Maybe they even went into foster care for a little bit of time, whatever. So they've had these experiences. What are some of the physical things that might crop up for an adult? I'm 45, I went through this when I was 4. What might be true of my life here on the other side?
So some of those things that really can come from having adverse childhood experiences, as we know, a propensity to use substances, a propensity to not be able to cope well, and even maybe have an earlier death than normal. The truth is that trauma doesn't just affect our brains, it affects our entire body. And so when there is not treatment or when there is not help, it can really have lasting impacts on all of us.
I was surprised to find out there are things like COPD and liver conditions and heart conditions and things like that are all related back to adverse childhood experiences, that it actually has this very lasting, or the potential to have a lasting physical impact, especially when no intervention happened, right? So you have this 4-year-old who's had these experiences, and it, 40 years ago it was pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you're going to be fine. And there was not any kind of intervention. And then we see this, adults with these medical conditions. However, now that we know better, then we're trying to get some interventions for children while they're young in order to prevent some of this adult stuff later, correct? And that's a lot of what you do.
Yeah, it is.
Like, we're really happy to have you. Because we see that children who come through like our Safe House or our programs have mostly experienced a lot of these adverse childhood experiences. And, so we're doing these interventions so that they're not, maybe they come to us and they're on this pathway toward these, like, this pretty major medical issues in their adulthood, and you're able to kind of pivot that path and get them to a healthier adulthood, which is fantastic, which brings back some of what we were talking around resiliency. So how do resiliency and ACEs interact? Like, what's the connection there?
ACEs and resiliency absolutely interact. I have found that from working with people that both children and adults are highly resilient, and when they are given the right tools, coping skills, knowing that things are not their fault, knowing that they can have a different life than what they were given, really evokes that resiliency in both kids and adults. And so what I just want to say today is that you absolutely can recover from anything that has happened to you.
And right now, there may be somebody at home who's hearing about all of this for the first time, and they're realizing that they themselves experienced things as a child, or they're realizing, hey, my child has been exposed to a lot more of these things than I really thought about, and they're wondering, how can I get help? What could I do today to change either where I'm at as an adult, and or where my child is, in their development. So what are some of the things? For one, I would say call our crisis line.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So our crisis line number, 1-800-575-5352. And you can call that number. You can talk about, hey, I heard this thing about ACEs. This is what happened when I was a kid, or this is what I've seen in my child. Or if you have any questions around any of the things that we're talking about and you just want more information, feel free to call our crisis line, and we'll have a conversation. And then possibly somebody is there and they realize, I'm experiencing violence, trauma, and my child is experiencing it too, and I want to get help. That's the perfect number to call, and we can talk to you about what services may be available. But also, then if they do call and they end up in one of our therapy programs, say, what are some of the interventions that a stand-up posture therapist might do with either with a child or with an adult who maybe experienced this 30 years ago?
That's a great question. I know that calling for therapy can be one of those daunting things that can feel overwhelming. But what all of our therapists at Stand Up Placer really strive to do is to be, first, aware of ACEs. Second, be aware of how the trauma that you've experienced is affecting your day-to-day life. And then we really tailor treatment to you. We get to know you, we get to work with you, and we also are educated and trained in modalities like EMDR and brain spotting, which are really amazing ways of working with trauma.
Okay, so probably a lot of folks out there don't know a lot about some of these things. So can you tell me a little bit, what does EMDR stand for, and how do you do that?
So EMDR stands for Eye Movement Desensitization Reprocessing, and brain spotting is very similar to EMDR. What those types of modalities do is they work to process trauma in a natural way in the parts of the brain where trauma, emotions, and memory lives. As we're talking here today, we're using the very cognitive, heady, thoughty part of our brain. If I can make up some words.
I'm totally going to use thoughty later.
Yes. Yeah, the part of our brain that analyzes, that makes sense of the world. And that's really where trauma does not live. So those types of modalities work to attack the areas of the brain where trauma is stored and where it lives.
Awesome. And so a child who has experienced trauma, say somebody calls you today and they have a 4-year-old who they want to bring in for therapy. What kinds of things, what might it look like? Because it could be daunting. I know for me, if I had a 4-year-old who had experienced some things, and I was even nervous about even having some of these opening conversations, would be hard. And then the thought of, now I'm going to bring them into, what are you going to hook probes up to their head? What are you going to do? What can I expect?
Absolutely.
And so what would there's a mom at home somewhere listening to this right now who has a young child. What is the youngest we would serve, or what might they expect coming in to a therapy relationship for their child?
Yeah, that's another fantastic
Thank
question.
you.
Yes, adult treatment and child treatment is very, very different. So what we do when we work with kiddos is we do what they love to do best, which is play. All of our therapists are able to use play and use games to help kids process their emotions. They're able to talk about things, and they're able to learn new coping skills and how to have conversations in an appropriate way with their parents. And we do other things like sand tray therapy. Kids love to get their hands in the sand and kind of play and create stories around their lives. And so we really have treatments for both adults and children.
And what might it be like for an adult who they experienced something 30 years ago, but they're just now realizing maybe they should come and have a conversation about it? What would that be like?
Yeah, this is kind of what I tell all of my clients. I don't like to throw anyone in the deep end of the swimming pool without any swimmies on. So don't feel like you're going to come in and we're just going to dive into the worst thing that you've ever experienced in your life. We're going to get to know one another. We're going to kind of, again, get to know how trauma affects your life and where it shows up. And we're going to slowly inch towards that thing that really sticks with you and really gets in the way of you living your life.
And something that we've talked a lot about lately is just how do kids experience trauma, right? Mm-hmm. So the difference between, like, say you live in a home, you have a 6-month-old, you have a 6-year-old, and you have a 16-year-old mm-hmm. who all live in that home. Something very traumatic happens. There's a domestic violence incident. There's, one parent has brutally beaten the other parent. There were loud noises, and dinner didn't happen. Everybody went to bed hungry. Mm-hmm. How would each of those, the victim of the violence, the 16-year-old, the 6-year-old, the 6-month-old, how would they each experience that trauma mm-hmm. differently?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the answer to that is it would be different. Each person, even if they experience the same kind of trauma, will experience it differently. What we know is that no matter what age you are, when you have trauma, it's affecting your brain, the wiring in your brain, memory pathways, and it affects your entire body. It's hard to say what would really happen to each individual mm-hmm. person, but we all have different personality types. We all have different coping skills. We all have different experiences. Mm-hmm. And so what we do know is that trauma will affect us all in different ways, and it won't look the same.
Right. Mm-hmm. I think that's really important because a lot of times people think, well, my 16-year-old seemed fine the next day, so I'm sure, the others were too young to really even understand what was going on, mm-hmm. or where we know that, like, a 6-month-old mm-hmm. growing up in a home with domestic violence, it's actually changing the way that their brain mm-hmm. wires, right? Absolutely. It's their neural pathways around how do I experience love and trust, mm-hmm. and is fear more related with bonding, or is love more related with bonding? Mm-hmm. And it can really change the hardwiring of their brain, where a 16-year-old maybe 5 years from now is going to be able to tell you everything that happened mm-hmm. that night, be able to tell you who said what, who threw what, mm-hmm. What happened when law enforcement showed up, what happened when the ambulance showed up. The 6-month-old may have no memory of it, but may have more lasting effects from that violence mm-hmm. just based on the fact that it changed the way their brain developed.
Absolutely. Their little bodies and their brains are like sponges, so they're taking in everything, and when they're that little, they don't really have the ability to kind of speak up for themselves or flee. They're kind of at the mercy of what's going on in the household. And so absolutely it is changing the wiring in their brain, and at that point they don't have conscious memories that are going to be formed. And so there's often, for many kids who have trauma at that age, kind of this felt experience in mm-hmm. their bodies that they're not sure where it comes from, but that it does have lasting impacts.
Right. And so we've talked a little bit about some of the trauma experiences that people have, adults, kids, around like car accidents and, mm-hmm. and trauma like that. But an agency like ours at Stand Up Placer, we're talking about domestic violence, sexual assault, and human trafficking. Those are the three where we end up with having to process those kind of things with our families. And I talk a lot about, there's always a video, someone's caught on video in the middle of a domestic violence dispute, right? There was one with a football player a few years ago and went viral. I still can envision that moment. I can still see where he was standing, what it was like when he hit her, how she fell, how he dragged her out of an elevator, right? I wasn't there. I don't know these people. It was black and white. I was safely in my own home when I saw that video. And you picture how it must be for a child who is witnessing this, something like that, but it's in 3D, right? It's in color. They're hearing the sounds. It's the people that they love the most, and it's the people who are in charge of making sure they have dinner that night, making sure that they're going to be safe, but they're the ones who are making them unsafe. And so when people might think, does domestic violence really impact the kids? They weren't hit. They stayed in a different room while it was going on, so they were fine. But it sounds like what we're talking about here is like, no, they're not. They experienced it as fully as the victim of the abuse.
Yeah, absolutely. Safety is one of those things that is really an important part of a child's development, and knowing that they have people in their life to care for them, to keep them safe, to protect them. And so when safety is compromised, it can definitely have lasting impacts on how children grow up, how they interact with their world, and how they see intimate relationships.
Right. And just like if we compare sort of domestic violence to the car accident story that we were talking about, we could have twin 4-year-olds in the backseat of a car. One car accident happens, right? The trauma is going to affect them differently. One might have a broken leg, one might have a broken arm. That doesn't mean that one child is wrong, right?
Right.
And so when we look at things around violence and, sexual assault or any of those things, the same or very similar things can happen to different people, and they may experience it very differently.
Absolutely.
And, just kind of, they're both valid, right? They
are both valid.
And you and your amazing team are there to meet them where they're at and to really help them. And then we also have advocates who can help with things like emergency food and clothing. And you work really closely with the advocates, right? If a client tells you in therapy, I'm afraid because I don't have food tonight, you're able to connect them to an advocate to get that food.
Absolutely.
That's awesome. So I'm really excited to continue this conversation. We're going to do a part 2 and talk a little bit more in depth around how do we help children get through things like this. We're going to talk a little bit more about trauma and domestic violence and sexual assault and human trafficking. So make sure that you find that episode either on ACTV on Channel 20 or on YouTube later. Go look them up and find out more about how you can get help for yourself, for your family. Maybe you have a friend who needs this assistance, and you can contact Stand Up Placer and find out about the therapy programs or housing programs or safe house programs and get connected in your community. And remember that you can call our crisis line to ask more questions at 1-800-575-5352. And we're there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week to help you get connected to the services that you may need. So I want to thank you so much, Renee, for being here. I'm looking forward to the part 2 to this episode. And I want to thank ACTV for hosting us, and thank all of you out in the community who tune in and listen, because you are there trying to make a difference for the people in your life and for our community and make our community a stronger place. So thank you so much. Tune in again, and we'll continue this conversation.